Hello, everyone. My name is Garvin, and I read things and ramble on about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today, we're going to cover the unapproved and unofficial history of the Earth Alliance. This video was selected by my ever-wise patrons, and if you'd like a vote in what content I cover in the future, feel free to join us at my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. There's a link in the description. There are polls up there right now for you to vote in. Now, the official approved history is there for those of you who prefer to stick to that, but honestly, there are gaps, among other things. This video is to help provide context and fill in those gaps. So, with all that said, let's dive in to the unapproved history of the Earth Alliance. Once again, we start with the 21st century, and in World War III, that kicks off around 2080. When Indonesia attempted to annex some of its neighbors on the Pacific Rim, and India objected. This was enough to bring in Pakistan and the United Islamic Nations, who were mostly centered in the Middle East, but also reached into Central Asia, and basically it was an all pile on to India kind of situation. Now, Pakistan normally wouldn't be able to stand up to the economic and military forces of India, but united with the Islamic nations who were sending money, equipment, and troops, this allowed Pakistan to stay in the fight longer than anyone expected, as well as providing industrial areas to repair and replenish equipment that Indian armed forces couldn't touch. Things started going poorly for India real quick at that point, so they appealed to Bangladesh, Nepal, and most importantly, the People's Republic of China. Now, China and India weren't traditional allies by the midpoint of the 21st century, but they had worked out many of their conflicts and were heavily engaged in mutually beneficial trade. With the decoupling of the Western states from China, China needed India to fuel its prosperity and continued growth. And China knew that. So, China intervened. The Chinese military was a large, powerful modern force, and their sudden intervention sent Pakistan and the Islamic forces reeling. Unable to fight the sheer weight and firepower of India and the People's Republic of China at the same time. And to be fair, it's an open question of even if the United States, the dominant military power of the time, could fight both nations at once. Pakistan reacted by grabbing the biggest stick it had and launched tactical nuclear weapons on advancing Chinese forces. This is the first time nuclear weapons were used in war since 1945, over 100 years before this. The Chinese reacted out of fear of a mass Pakistani strategic launch and fired about a dozen ICBMs at Pakistan, but all those missiles were destroyed in midair, and no one took credit for it. A second strike was ordered, but it had the same results, and a Pakistani counterstrike was likewise just blown out of the air. While low-flying cruise missiles and tactical nuclear artillery would work, any attempt at a long-range strike was simply deleted without any explanation. While this kept the nuclear desolation confined to the front lines, for the most part, this still wreaked utter havoc on the militaries of everyone involved and started a humanitarian crisis. The United Nations, in response, attempted to get both sides to agree to stop using nuclear weapons at least, but any attempts they made were just soundly rejected, complete with the People's Republic vetoing it in the Security Council, which was the basically upper chamber of the United Nations of the time. So this led to the United States, the European Union, and the Russian Federation completely cutting off trade and financial services to any of the combatant nations. A complete blockade. This sudden full stop devastated the economy of just about all the combatants who were already massively overstrained by this huge effort. The effects were felt worst of all in China because their economy was incredibly dependent on raw resources coming in from Russia. And having lost most of their overseas markets and India being in no condition to help hold up the Chinese economy, the result was just an utter collapse. And this led to a lot of smoldering rebellions and insurgencies exploding. Now, to be fair, this didn't just happen in China. It happened in India. It happened in the Central Asian and Middle Eastern countries as well. But China got it worst of all because they just weren't prepared for Russia to be one of the nations cutting them off. Which is why, after a very brief but bloody civil war, the new Chinese military government placed the blame on Russia because they had seen Russia as a quasi ally against the West and other power blocs and were completely caught off guard for the Russians cutting them off. So the Chinese decided that if the Russians weren't going to sell their raw resources, China was just going to take them. And the Russians were not prepared for this. The Chinese military government convinced their population that this had all been a Russian plot to destroy and invade China, and in mid-2082 invaded Russia. Once again, long-range nuclear weapons were fired by both sides and destroyed. Only this time, the culprit was revealed. In the latter half of the 21st century, the United States was a nation that had lost a lot of its comparable advantages versus other nations, but remained the dominant military and economic power on the globe. It was also a nation that was very active in Earth orbit. In fact, at the time, a lot of the orbital infrastructure that most people used on Earth was American in origin, and the Americans had used that as a cover to emplace what they claimed were defensive weapons. This is the Earth Shield satellite network. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This was in direct violation of a number of international agreements and laws, but the American counter to this has always been, and likely will always be, would you rather we let billions of Chinese, Indians, and Middle Eastern people die and the entire continent of Asia be turned into a radioactive wasteland? Which is hard to argue against, but there are those who feel that the Americans, by destroying these strikes and not interacting in any other way, intentionally allowed the war to drag on, which the Indians and the Chinese were large rivals of theirs, and there was no love lost between the Middle Eastern states and the Americans, so there might be something to that argument as well. The Chinese invasion of Russia did spread the war all across Asia, and the Korean conflict reignited, and fighting just spread across the whole continent, and that's when the Western powers actively got involved. And it would take until 2084 that the war would be declared officially over, but there would be scattered fighting and, quote, police actions, unquote, in Asia until 2085. No borders were changed, but a region stretching from the Middle East to the Pacific Ocean was in ruins. The world economy was in shambles, and the United Nations itself was dissolved. Hundreds of millions had died as a direct result of the war, and more would follow as a result of the disease and famine now running riot. The Western powers, once again in an unchallenged position by being the only major powers who had avoided any fighting on their territory, had a vision on how to prevent another world war. The unified Earth Force would unite all military formations and commands under a single organization, thus making war impossible because there'd be no one to fight. This would evolve into the Unified Earth Alliance in 2084, and finally just the Earth Alliance, which would become a world government. Now, outside of Australia, North America, and Europe, enthusiasm for the plan was honestly low. Many seeing this as just a plot to cement permanent American domination of the world. The Russians and Chinese saw it as an attempt at a stealth annexation, and they just outright refused to be part of the Earth Alliance. Interestingly enough, most of the actual combatants of the war, the Middle Eastern nations, India, Pakistan, and so on, would join Russia and China in refusing to join the Earth Alliance out of a combination of fear of becoming colonial subjects, again, for a lot of these nations, bitterness, and a feeling that they were being taken advantage of. The African and South American states, however, signed on, as did Japan, the newly unified Republic of Korea, and Israel. Most of Europe did, although France famously refused to consider entering. For many of these states, it was the simple calculation that they needed the promised Western economic aid, because even if they hadn't been part of the fighting, their economies had been massively disrupted with the destruction of world trade, and, well, let's be honest, there was a underlying fear of American orbital weapons. The U.S. government never threatened anyone with these weapons, but, well, they didn't have to. In the back of everyone's mind was the thought that, while the U.S. had proven it had an utter veto on the use of long-range nuclear weapons, it never promised not to use its own sizable arsenal of those same nuclear weapons. So maybe it was best to just accept the inevitable while there were still being carrots on offer and not just a stick. That said, in those early days, the founding nations of the Earth Alliance kept most of their promises, sharing Western technology and using Western industry to not just rebuild the economies of the other nations, but to bring a new degree of prosperity and wealth to those nations that signed up. This created a temptation that was incredibly hard to resist. Egypt and Libya would break ranks with the Middle East and join in 2093, and France would cave and join in 2096. Another advantage for the Earth Alliance was that the nations opposed to it were not cooperating. Pakistan and India remained deadly hostile to each other, and Russia and China were never really able to forgive each other for the brutalities suffered in World War III. Ironically, it's because of that Russia agreed to join in 2101, because they were fearing another Chinese invasion and saw Earth Force as their best protection. The Chinese military responded by proving Russian fears true and attempted to attack and overwhelm Russia before its membership took effect. But Earth Force responded by completely annihilating the invading force while suffering only the lightest of casualties. The Chinese government, seeing this, surrendered and requested membership into the Earth Alliance, and it was granted. Seeing this object lesson, the Pakistani and Indian governments also folded and joined the Earth Alliance in 2102. The remaining Middle Eastern states, however, remained defiant. At first, the Earth Alliance government was content to simply leave them be, confident that the benefits of memberships would bring them in eventually. This changed when an Iranian-based terrorist group employed a small nuclear device against Israel in 2105. The result was the Earth Alliance placing the entire Middle East under siege, cutting off the nations from the outside world completely, allowing no trade, no travel, no nothing. The Middle Eastern nations responded with violence, using mainly terrorist tactics because open warfare at this point would have just been an expensive form of suicide. The Earth Alliance decided it had enough of this and invaded each nation one by one, removed the governments, and forcibly inducted them into the alliance. Now, in all honesty, many of the people of the Middle East were more than happy to accept Earth Alliance rule, as it promised an end to violence and poverty in the region, but it has remained a sore point in the Middle East that they were not allowed to join of their own free will, but were basically dragged in as conquered provinces. At this point, the Earth Alliance government tried to cool everything down and shift everyone's focus to space exploration, returning to Mars and expanding various moon bases, but mistakes were made. As instead of expanding space industries to every member state, the Earth Alliance chose to use and expand the pre existing launch facilities in the West. They didn't even rebuild the Russian launch facilities that had largely been destroyed in World War III. This left the other member states feeling like space was a West only club, and it created a wedge between the Western states and the other states, some of whom started funding raider groups to attack various mining and other corporate concerns in the outer solar system around the asteroid belt. At first, since there were no military forces out in space to counter this, the various private concerns, corporations, worker co-ops, and others unified into a organization called the Belt Alliance. While it had its roots in a paramilitary operation, today the Belt Alliance is an economic bloc of deep space explorers, corporations, and workers' union, and they kind of took a step back from their military role when the Earth Force Fleet was built and deployed to police the solar system. Despite all the new resources coming in from space, economic development on Earth stalled. And while this wasn't noticeable in the Western countries, it was felt rather keenly in South America, in Africa, and other non Western nations. And that wedge between the member states got a little wider. And it cracked into a full out gap in 2117 when telepaths were proven to be real and the Earth Alliance demanded total control over them. Now, there were reasons for this. For one thing, there were pogroms and mass murders against suspected telepaths, as actual witch hunts flared up and people were burned alive. They were tortured. They were murdered in terrible ways. And this resulted in the setting up of the Metasensory Regulation Authority, which did help put an end to at least the worst of the atrocities, but it also made the telepaths a captive people. They lost the right to vote. They lost their property rights. They couldn't even live among their fellow citizens and were mostly confined to a settlement in Switzerland nicknamed Teep Town. Meanwhile, the Earth Alliance government felt very free to use the gifts of telepaths for economic benefit and for the benefit of the Earth government, and that gap just got wider and wider as a result of this behavior, especially since many telepaths did not feel like becoming captive serfs to the Earth Alliance. Russia and China had never entirely discontinued their own national militaries like they were supposed to, and this caused them to both begin quiet expansion and rearmament campaigns. Both nations felt that telepaths were a national resource. It did not care to see what they saw as a Western-dominated government having sole authority over them. They also felt left out of the wealth of the exploration and economic exploitation of the solar system. For that matter, India felt much the same way, but its rearmament was much more modest. Another group, which a lot of people nicknamed the Liberal Bloc, was led by nations like New Zealand, Japan, and Amazonia, and their main complaint was that EA rules governing telepaths were brutal and verged incredibly close to slavery, which they weren't wrong. I prefer the term serfs because Under EA rules, a telepath could not be bought and sold. They weren't considered property, but they were very much the chattel of the government. This is hair splitting, though, so those of you who just prefer to use the slave term, feel free. Meanwhile, over in the Middle East, many of those states felt oppressed by having to live under Western style legal and political systems and considered Earth Alliance rule to be basically a new colonial government. They protested, they argued, and in the end they turned to terrorist violence. And this reached an awful climax when in 2150, one of the anti-EA Middle Eastern terrorist groups set off an old Soviet nuclear weapon in downtown San Diego. The Earth Alliance response was swift and brutal, declaring worldwide martial law and the curtailing of many individual freedoms. This only confirmed the fears of many. Russia and China accelerated their military buildup, determined to declare independence by the end of the decade. China allied with Korea and India. Russia allied with Pakistan. The liberal bloc openly confronted the central government over the issues of telepaths, especially after 100 telepaths burned alive in Mexico rather than be taken to the MRA, and demanded that unless reforms were made and more rights granted to telepaths, they would succeed. Meanwhile, African states began to openly discuss succession on the basis of the failure of the EA to keep its social and economic promises. By 2156, many were openly predicting the death of the Earth Alliance and feared a new Dark Age. But salvation came in the most unlikely form. A Centauri survey vessel dropped out of hyperspace near Jupiter and made first contact with the Earth Alliance. While first contact was peaceful and relations with the Centauri would be incredibly profitable for humanity, opening up the entire galaxy to us, in fact, everyone knows it could have gone the other way. And suddenly, humanity no longer felt it had the luxury of fighting wars with itself. Negotiations were renewed, deals were made, and the cracks were papered over. Instead, humanity would focus on reaching out to the galaxy and taking whatever it had to offer. In order to avoid becoming a client or subject species, it was felt our best bet was to expand quickly to claim new resources and space. Deep Space Exploration Command was created, and at first they rented space on Centauri vessels, then they bought old ships from the Centauri and other aliens, and finally, we built our own gates and jump drives. Luckily, no alien race was all that close to Earth, so there was plenty of unclaimed space to grab, and grab humanity did. This did lead to some skirmishes with minor alien powers, and later on the Narn. The first minor alien power was a race known as the Kolani, who had not expanded much beyond their home system. When the Earth Alliance constructed a trade route that came too close to their space, instead of diplomatically protesting, the Kolani chose violence. The resulting battle in 2169 was a bloody one for Earth Force, but served to teach valuable lessons. Earth managed to solve the issue diplomatically, preventing the violence from spiraling out of control. The next battle was with the Chalantis, a former subject race of the Centauri who had turned to isolationism since achieving their independence and were willing to go to any lengths to protect that independence, which I can respect. When the Earth Alliance got too close to their space, they also went straight to violence. This also happened in 2169, although later that year. This is pretty much when Earth reached most of its modern borders. This battle, due to the release of an improved starfighter class, went a lot better for Earth Force, and the Chalantis withdrew. There was a debate about what to do next, but the overall feeling in the Earth Alliance was an unwillingness to be conquerors or to try to attempt conquest of an alien race. So fortification, consolidation, and diplomacy were the order of the day. As the 23rd century dawned, Narn forces began raiding and probing human space. Because of our close association with the Centauri, the Narn saw us as possible collaborators and allies to the Centauri Empire and wanted to take humanity's full measure. In addition, Mars and other colonies became increasingly restless, wanting more internal autonomy, and this came to a head in 2212 when Mars broke out into open revolt, but was crushed in a matter of weeks, driving the Martian resistance underground, both metaphorically and literally. In the waning days of the revolt, however, a Martian loyalist assassinated President Hideyoshi, which led to the Senate applying harsh sanctions, which really stirred further resentments and killed any hope of Martian Earth rapprochement. Meanwhile, the Narns tried to claim the Earth system of Epsilon Indi, leading to a situation of Earth controlling the inner system while the Narn controlled the outer, both using their own jump gate. This situation hit its flashpoint in 2219 when the Narn attacked a Earth cargo vessel. The Earth counterattack pushed the Narns back to their main base, but in a strategic blunder, the Narn did not reinforce their base, but launched about a half a dozen small raids on other Earth systems that were fought off by local defenses. This allowed Earth Force to concentrate their forces and push the Narn out of Epsilon Indi entirely. After a couple years of pointless sparring, the Narn and the Earth Alliance signed a peace treaty and non-aggression pact in 2224. Which leads us to the Dilgar. As I mentioned last video, when they discovered their sun was going to go supernova, they rejected asking other races for help or even just asking to be allowed to pass through other races' space peacefully. This is because the Dilgar had united under an ideology that was very much like fascism, where they held their race to be superior and believed all aliens to be polluted and lesser. And they felt that asking help from these polluted lesser beings was beneath them. So, after securing that jumping off point in Narn space, where they also inflicted atrocities on the Narn, they attacked the Alakan Republic in 2228, overwhelming them and committing genocide with a genetically tailored plague. In 2230, their forces would slam into Drazi and Abai space. The Abai were pushed back to their homeworld, but managed to hold there, and the Dilgar were perfectly happy to just bottle them up, since they weren't particularly interested in the Abai's homeworld. They considered those worlds unsuitable for long-term resettlement. Drazi were likewise pushed back and isolated from the rest of the League of Non-Aligned Worlds. For those of you who didn't see that first video, the League of Unaligned Worlds is a loose alliance and economic bloc of minor alien races. Satisfied that they had contained the Drazi and the Abai and could do that long enough to complete their mission, they advanced into Belosian space, driving the Belosians underground. Literally, in this case, the Belosians had a vast tunnel network. After that, they attacked the Hayak, the Prakiri, Kaskor, and Ipsha, driving each of these races back to their homeworld and laying them under siege. They would also use biological weapons in every one of their campaigns to whittle down the populations of their enemies. The Dilgar's goal was the homeworld of a race known as the Maitak, a race that was even newer to space than humanity and sadly would never get to reach their full potential. Because the Dilgar seized their world, destroyed their tiny fleet, and genocided them mercilessly, all while transporting the people of the Dilgar homeworld to Maitak. If the Dilgar had stopped there, they would have written an incredibly dark history for themselves in the galaxy, but they might have been able to hold on to their conquest. However, the Dilgar had grown greedy and began to think they could seize all of League space. They launched attacks on the Hur and the Discari, pursuing Discari ships even into Earth space and exchanging fire with Earth Alliance vessels. Up until this point, Earth had been viewing these actions with alarm and concern, but among other things, there was a question of could Earth Force even sustain a campaign so deep into alien space? And under pressure, Earth Force spent years building the logistical capabilities to do that while praying to never use them. Those prayers were in vain. The Dilgar invaded Markab space in 2232. The Markab at the time were one of the closest allies and trading partners of the Earth Alliance. The Earth Alliance decided enough was enough, and without a declaration of war, crossed the Markab border and smashed into the Dilgar fleet. Now, here's something you're not likely to hear. The Dilgar were honestly more advanced than Earth Force, and it's kind of a dirty little secret that many modern Earth ships have weapons that were originally reverse engineered Dilgar weapons today. The big advantage was that the Dilgar had spread themselves incredibly thin and were at the end of their supply lines, and their choice of bottling up a dozen species into sieges on their homeworlds for future mass murder came back to bite them, since they couldn't fight the Drazi, Earth, hold the space they had conquered, maintained all these sieges, and Earth damn well knew it. The combined Markab Earth fleet under the command of Admiral Hamamoto successfully pinned down and destroyed the Dilgar in detail, destroying isolated formations and rolling them up. They also gathered additional forces from liberated space as each siege was lifted, and only added to the strength of the Allies. During the liberation of Maitok, the Dilgar showed the depths of their malice by burning that world to cinders. This was a mistake, though, as it only strengthened the disgust and anger of the Allies and left everyone determined to carry this war to the bitter end. There would not be a second Dilgar war, was the agreement. The Dilgar also made a strategic mistake when confronted with this. They chose to concentrate their forces against the Drazi, hoping to knock the Drazi entirely out of the war, secure their supply lines, and then, as the plan went, they would fall upon the Allies like monsters on children. Admiral Hamamoto decided to press his advantage, however, and attack into the Balos system to prevent the Dilgar from being able to take out the Drazi. The Dilgar, however, had set up an ambush, and the battle turned into a months-long back-and-forth brawl that often left Earth forces stranded on the planet. Thankfully, the natives survived in enough numbers to bring the Gropos into the tunnels and keep fighting. Admiral Hamamoto led the final attack on the Battle of Balos personally, striking at Dilgar communications and command facilities and destroying them, leaving the Dilgar fleet isolated and swiftly retreating in the face of Allied force. The Dilgar hoped the fortification of their home system would be enough to make the Allies turn to diplomacy. They were mistaken in just how enraged everyone was. Too many genocides had happened at this point. Too many plagues. Too many famines. In late 2232, the assault on the Dilgar homeworld began. It would claim the life of Admiral Hamamoto and cause incredibly heavy casualties among Earth Force, but it also resulted in the utter destruction of the Dilgar space forces. Every surviving Dilgar was dumped on their homeworld, and automated satellites were in place to destroy any attempt at rebuilding any space capabilities. The supply of Quantum-40 was seized and awarded to Earth, as I mentioned before, and then the Allies left, unaware of the death building up in the Dilgar's home star, which went supernova in 2235, rendering the Dilgar extinct. The saddest part to me on all of this is how unnecessary this all was. But because the Dilgar's poisonous, racist ideology forbade them from even telling the Allies of their doom, they would rather die than ask for help even when they had been driven to their knees. And honestly, their prior actions meant most of the League had no problems with their fate. No one mourns the Dilgar, and that is because of the pain and suffering the Dilgar inflicted on the galaxy. This is a warning to the rest of us of the dangers of falling into the idea that other races, just because they're aliens, are lesser or polluted or they don't have as many rights as we do. This can only lead to self destruction, and we always need to be aware of the dangers of embracing the idea of hating people just because they're different. After this came a painfully brief golden age. However, we did not learn the lesson that hubris is poison, and we sent out Captain Jakowski, an officer woefully unqualified for command, to make first contact with the Minbari. As a result, he fired on the Minbari when they approached in peace, panicked by the fact that the Minbari sensors were so powerful that they jammed Earthship's networks by accident, and seeing the gun ports on the Minbari ships open, rather than trying to find an alternate means of communication or even just doing the sensible thing and withdrawing, Captain Janowski did the worst thing he could do and opened fire, killing the leader of the Minbari state and causing damage to the very governing body of the Minbari, the mysterious Great Council. This enraged the Minbari so completely that they utterly destroyed the Earth Alliance local bases and ships and then tracked them back to Earth space. While the League did attempt diplomatic actions, their warfighting potential was still in ruins from the Dilgar War, and the Drazi actually sent a fleet that disappeared in hyperspace. The Minbari made it clear they were out for blood, and anyone who got too close to the Earthers would be on the list. Cowed by an entire fleet of the League's strongest navy vanishing without a trace, the League was unable to make any effective actions and chose to save themselves. And I'm going to be honest here, there's not much I think the League in their situation could have done even if they had thrown in. Does that mean that we shouldn't be somewhat upset at how completely we were cut off? No, there's nuance here, but let's not be upset that other people decided not to commit suicide for our sake, is what I'm saying. Surprisingly, the Narn were happy to help by selling us weapons. Of course, we found out after the war they were selling us Centauri weapons, perhaps thinking that if the Minbari did find out, they would blame the Centauri Empire and attack the Centauri. So, take that for what it's worth. Thankfully, the Minbari focused on military targets, showing little interest in murdering civilians. Yet. This means, unlike the Dilgar, where casualties were in the billions, the Minbari War resulted in the deaths of just 250,000 humans. I shouldn't say just, it's still a big number, but compared to the deaths the Minbari could inflicted, well, it's a small favor, I suppose. Victories were far and few between. There's the victory of John Sheridan leading the crew of the Hyperion to destroy the Black Star, and not much else. The whole time, the Earth Alliance broadcasted its willingness to negotiate and eventually to surrender under almost any terms, as long as the Minbari promised to allow the human species to survive, even if that meant things like the wholesale execution of the Earth government. The Minbari's utter silence in response was blood-chilling. In 2248, the Minbari attacked Earth. 20,000 men and women and every armed ship they could find went into Earth orbit to buy time for evacuation fleets to take men and women to neutral space. The Minbari butchered the fleet of the line like they were cattle. Out of 2,000 people, only 200 or survive. And to this day, many of them are unable to even speak about their experience. However, it was here with Earth's last desperate defense shattered and Earth prone, defenseless, and broken, the Minbari surrendered and, without any further communication, withdrew. Earth had survived and would rebuild. Many felt bitter towards the League despite the League's efforts. Most just felt lucky to be alive, and since most of the economic infrastructure was untouched, Earth was able to rebuild and bounce back rather quickly. The Babylon Project was developed to help find a way to end wars like the Earth-Minbari War and the Dilgar War. As I mentioned earlier, Babylons 1, 2, and 3 were destroyed by terrorist action. And after the disappearance of Babylon 4, the project was almost abandoned entirely. But surprisingly, the Minbari then contacted Earth and offered to pay for Babylon 5's construction as long as they were consulted in the selection of the station's commanding officer. With a combination of terror and gratitude, Earth accepted. The rest, as I said in my last video, is current events. Whew! This was a long one, folks. Thanks for sticking with me. I would like to give special thank yous to the folks of r/Babylon5 on Reddit and spacebattles.com for helping me track down sources on the actions of the League during the Earth-Minbari War. Also, special thank you to Big Steve, who remains my biggest supporter. Well, I hope you found all of this informative, or at least entertaining. If so, please leave a like or a comment, or consider subscribing. All of those help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. Next week, as demanded by my ever-wise patrons, we return to Dick Month, where I look at the works of Philip K. Dick. We'll be kicking off with the novel and then the movie, Free Radio Albemuth. I hope you join me. Until then, take care of yourselves, each other, and of course, keep reading.